The following presentation was recorded live at Politics for Lunch on January 26, 2016. David Longanecker is the president of the Western Interstate Commission of Higher Education, also known as WICHE. Mr. Longanecker spoke on funding higher education.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. What I'm going to do is talk to you about how much higher education in America has changed since the beginning of the new millennium, and what that has meant for Idaho, and how Idaho has changed, and what things are looking like in the short term as we move forward. To sort of start that discussion, I think it might be useful to sort of remind folks where Idaho was at the beginning of this century. And those of you who worked in higher education at that time will remember a publication that came out for the first time in 2000 called Measuring Up. It was called Measuring Up 2000, and then every 2 years thereafter until 2010 there were publications. This was put out by something called a group called the National Center for Public Policy in Higher Education. Pat Callan was the head of that organization, and they were putting out, and they were giving grades to all of the states on how well they were doing in higher education. And I don't know why I put 2002 up there, but it's 2000, this report. And here's how they graded Idaho at that period of time. On preparation of the students for post-secondary, they gave you folks a D+. On participation, they gave you a D. On affordability, they gave you a B-. On completion of students who went to college, they gave you a C. On benefits of higher education to the state, they gave you a C. And on the issue of student learning, they gave you an incomplete. Now don't feel too bad about the incomplete, because they gave an incomplete to all 50 states. And that's because one of the interesting things about American higher education is we're pretty proud and we boast about the quality of our enterprise. I certainly do that. When I give speeches, I tell people that American higher education is the best in the world. And I can say that because we don't measure it, and nobody can prove me wrong. And that was the issue they were trying to address, is how do we know what we're achieving if we don't have good measures of the student learning? So I'm going to talk about how the world has changed in the last 15 years along these lines, and how that has affected Idaho in particular. So if we look at the first of the, what I'm going to suggest is that higher education in America has changed hugely during that period of time. It's changed why we do, the way in which, I'm getting pretty good. It has changed the way in which we provide that education. It's changed the who we educate. It's changed substantially the way we assess how well we're doing in the enterprise. And it has changed the way that we finance the enterprise. Now, I noticed a few faces I see from this morning. You're going to hear the same damn thing you heard earlier, but maybe you'll get it this time. The first of those is the way in which we're educating students, and that has changed just a whole lot in this last decade and a half. If one looks nationally, you'll see that there has been a huge increase in participation in post-secondary education during the last 15 years. From 2000 to 2014, enrollments across the country increased 31%. In the West, they increased 31%. And if you look, what's quite interesting about that, they increased in every sector, public, private, and for-profit. But there was a huge increase in the participation in the for-profit sector of higher education. Now, still not all that significant a portion. It's 11% of the total today in the West, 7% across the country. It was only 3% before. But there's been a radical increase in the share of students, particularly adult students, who participate in the for-profit sector of higher education. Idaho looks a little bit different than that. Actually a lot different. The rate of growth, believe this or not, 91% increase in enrollment in Idaho institutions in 15 years. That's phenomenal. if you think about it. Now, the most significant of those increases was actually in the private, not-for-profit sector. I suspect, I haven't really done the research, but I think that was the movement from Riggs being BYU, Idaho, and really becoming one of the premier sort of online providers in the country. So I think that's what accounts for that. But look at the public sector. Whereas the public sector in other areas grew by 19% and in both the WICHE states and the country, your public sector grew by 48%, almost half, again, as much as where you started in 15 years in terms of enrollment growth. It's really, that's a huge, huge increase during that period of time, and particularly given those were very difficult times financially for the state and for the country. So that's part of the story on how the why has changed, or the way we provide education has changed. Now on this, I don't have Idaho-specific information. Frankly, it wouldn't be very relevant because the way it's all reported is by where the institution is located that provides online. And what we know is online is ubiquitous to wherever a student wants to take it. And so it's not really reflected. If you look at the fact that those numbers on the growth shows the West growing very rapidly, well, that's partly because the University of Phoenix moved from about $45,000 for students to 450,000 students during that period of time. And that's a fairly substantial rate of growth. So, but what is key is how much more is going online than used to be the case. In 2000, online education certainly existed, but the internet was still pretty new, and about 10% of the students were taking a course in online. Only 2% were taking their entire education online around the country. Today, or 2013, 2 years ago, the last year for which we have data, 27% of the students are taking a course online every year. 1 out of every 4 students is taking a course online. And 13% of the students are taking their entire education online. A phenomenal change in the way in which we're providing the education. But it's more than just the use of technology and online that is different today. We're also, the new wave and movement in higher education is toward competency-based education. And that has really changed rapidly. In 2000, Bob will remember this, in 2000, there were basically 2 institutions we all knew about that were providing a competency-based approach to education. One was this lovely Catholic institution run by a group of wonderful nuns, Alverno College in Milwaukee. And they were doing this thing called competency-based education. They got grants from the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education to do this. Everybody thought we should be watching and see whether this idea works or not. Then there was Western Governors University, a new organization basically developed by the governors in the West, particularly by Levitt and Romer from Utah and Colorado, really pushing this. And it had already emerged at that point to have about 2,500 students at that period of time. Whole different story today. Competency is a wave at the present time, and it's huge. It's a big, huge wave. If one looks, you can see just WGU, which was 2,500 students in the year 2000, is 48,000 students today. It's recognized as a quasi-state institution in 5 states, as well as being a private institution operating in the other 45. And then there's actually an organization of competency-based educational providers. Now, many of these don't do more than just competency-based, but this isn't any longer a little club of 2. This includes some of the most prestigious institutions in the country, like the University of Wisconsin, that are very actively involved in developing entire components of their activity that are competency-based rather than course-based. Very different approach to education than we provided before. We now have well over 100,000 students taking their entire education through competency-based education, and millions that are taking a portion of it. In fact, you're pretty actively involved in this at the state policy level, and certainly I know Boise State better than the others, but you have a great deal of activity with prior learning assessment in the state. It's become more or less ubiquitous. This is where a student can demonstrate that they know what the learning outcomes of a course are, so that they don't have to take that ag courses, they already know everything they were supposed to get out of the course. Makes a lot of sense. Not to a lot of faculty, but it does make a lot of sense. But there's a third wave that's currently changing the way in which we do this. I've talked about just the numbers of students that we're serving. I've talked a lot about competency-based education, but we're also infatuated in higher education these days with innovation. You probably have an innovation center, Bob. I don't know, but
College.
You don't. You probably.
We have a college of innovation and design.
There you go. I mean, we're just infatuated with innovation. Not only telling others how they can innovate, which is what Bob does, in his program, but in innovating ourselves. And so what we're seeing is just a huge number of new institutions providing degrees. A lot of those are in the for-profit sector, but you have a new institution in Idaho that was created for a substantial need, the College of Western Idaho. There's been just a huge way of sort of coming at this in new ways to provide these degrees, both in expansion of existing institutions, new institutions, for-profit, not-for-profit, private, all over the place. But it's beyond that. We also now have a lot of new providers of bits and pieces of the educational process. We used to outsource food service, grounds and maintenance, some of those things. We're now outsourcing a lot of our core activity, our educational processing. A number of groups that offer courses. You can buy courses, particularly introductory courses, from other companies that will provide those. But in addition to courses, we're also now outsourcing a lot of student services. My favorite is Khan Academy, which provides mentoring and tutoring for students. They're in other courses in your campus, but they're struggling, and they go to Khan Academy and get some help in that regard. So there's just a plethora of new innovations that are coming along that are changing the way in which we do things. The Internet of Things is certainly going to fundamentally change the way in which our students learn in the future. Then there's a group of, I wasn't quite sure what to call them, so I called them tweeners. They aren't institutions of higher education. They're not accredited. They're sort of businesses, but they're offering more than courses. They're offering entire programs. And if you thought your boot camp was something you did in the Army, no, it's a way in which you learn how to code in different languages, computer science languages. Same with academies. And these are fully integrated programs. You go, you get your certification, which is the other thing that is changing radically. Is we used to have a pretty good idea what the credentials were from higher education. There were degrees. We knew what degrees were. There were credentials. We knew what credentials were, more or less. Well, now we have degrees, and they're pretty much still the same thing. We more or less know what that is. We've got certificates now. We've got certifications. Significant difference between the two. I'll explain it to you in a lecture afterwards if you'd like to hear. But it used to be we had an idea what those words meant. Now we have badges as well. I was a Boy Scout. I know what a badge is. But these are different badges, and they have significant meaning for various different audiences today. And so we're very infatuated with these ideas of how we will brand all of our new products and activities. Now, I think the real question before us, and still is the question for me, is whether this is creative engagement and progress in higher education, or whether it's just chaos. I'm in many conversations, maybe it's my age, but I can't understand what the people are saying. So that's one of the ways in which we're educating have changed. Now, brings me to who we're educating is changing. And that is changing very significantly, and very much so in Idaho. These are WICHE's projections of high school graduates. We do these for every state in the country. If you look back from where we are today is that line you can't quite see, the red one there. That's where we are today. If you look back, what you can see there is that you've had very modest growth in your high school graduation levels over the since the decade began. What's interesting about that growth, if you look at it, it did not come from the traditional population you served, white students. In fact, that has actually declined slightly during that period of time. It came entirely from the growth in the Hispanic population in the state. More than doubled the share of high school graduates during that period of time. And if you look forward, you will see that and one of the nice things about that level of growth is that reasonably you can manage that reasonably well as a system of higher education. Students coming in, a little bit extra money from, if they go to college, you get a little bit more marginal tuition revenues, universities can help you, and you can manage that. If you look at the future of this state, you're going to have very precipitous growth in the number of high school graduates. It would come in part from white students, but even much more dramatically than in the past from that Hispanic population. And the question is whether you're going to be prepared as a system of higher education to succeed with those students in a fashion better, frankly, than you have been able to succeed with them in the past. We'll come back to that. So you're going to have traditional age students coming in much larger numbers than you have in the past. But in addition to that, you're going to have a lot of more adults who need to come back. To meet your goal of 60% of your adult population with a college, with a post-secondary certificate of some fashion or another of value, you're going to have to bring back a lot of adults. What's really good news in Idaho, I was really surprised at putting this together, is that you've had more dramatic growth in the share of your adult population attending college than any of the other states with which I work. You've moved from 6.5% from 3.5% to 6%, almost doubling the share. Now, don't get too proud because that just brought you up to where the rest of the country was. But you were way behind. Part of the growth there, a great deal of the growth there, was a function of the establishment of the College of Western Idaho. I mean, you created an institution to serve these students who didn't have access to an open admissions institution after Boise State grew up. You have basically a big challenge there to sort of maintain that, but you're well on the way to doing that. But as I said, you have some gaps that you're going to have to address. This is the overall gap in the attainment level, the college attainment level of populations in your state. And you have one of the largest gaps in the country between your white population and your underrepresented minorities. It's not as bad as some other states, but it is a huge gap overall. And given you don't have a particularly high achievement level overall, that's even more significant for you. If you break that down a little bit, what you'll see here is for adults from the underrepresented minority groups, fully 2/3 of them have no more than a higher education. In fact, more of them don't have a high school education. That's almost non-existent for white students. If you look at college achievement, only 15% of the students of color, of the adults of color, have a college degree compared to almost 50% of the white population. This is a huge issue, and it's really an issue that has changed substantially since the beginning of the century. At the beginning of the century, we saw this as an issue of equity and social justice, and that's the way we talked about it as higher education. It was the wrong thing that we should have gaps like that. We needed to address it, and certainly that still exists. But what we also know today is that it's more than an issue of equity and social justice. It's an economic vitality issue as well. You cannot get to the point you need to be with that kind of gap in your population, your adult population. You have to find a way to be much more successful in serving those underrepresented groups in the future, or you simply won't have a vibrant economy. To give you an idea where you are in terms of vibrancy of your economy today, you wouldn't know this walking around Boise, but in fact your state isn't a leader isn't a globally competitive environment. You rank in the third quartile in terms of your vitality as a new economy state. This is an index put together by the Kauffman Foundation, which works on entrepreneurship, innovation, and global competitiveness. And they take about 40 variables and put them together, and you rank in the third quartile in those. Could be worse. You could be in the South, but you're not. One of the ways in which we're changing the way in which we educate is to look down. We're going into the high schools to work with students. You folks are quite active in the development of dual and concurrent enrollment. taking those high school students who are ready and able to do college work and making it possible for them to do so, and do so sooner than they are. And doing that not only through dual and concurrent, but through the advanced placement program, and through the international baccalaureate, and through the career and technical education programs. And you folks are doing pretty good in that regard, both in terms of state policy and in the boots on the ground. I was at the hearing this morning and listened to the community college talk about the growth and the numbers of students that are studying in dual and concurrent enrollment. It's really dramatic. But in addition to providing them college-level work at high school, we're trying to make sure that they're better prepared to do college-level work when they get to college. And so in order to do that, we've got the Common Core, which should bring our students to college much better prepared and ready to work. But we're also reinventing remedial education. We couldn't have done it much worse than we did it in the 20th century. If you look at the statistics on it, we didn't know how bad we were, and we were certainly trying. But if you look at the statistics, it was really a terrible story for higher education. But we're changing it through Complete College America, which you're very actively involved with Complete College Idaho. We're working very hard on reinventing remediation that we provide in our colleges to make students more successful. But we're also working with high schools to help them better understand how they can work with curriculum, how they can work with students that have fallen behind, so that we can essentially do the remediation while they're in high school. Washington State has passed legislation on that, Colorado has done that, California has done that, and there's just a lot of work that's being done in that regard. But in addition to looking down, we're looking up. We're looking at those adults who come back to college, who could come back to college, pick up what's necessary, not only to get the degree or certificate, that is the credential, but also the learning that comes with that. And there are 44 million Americans who have some college but no degree. This is the low-hanging apple. These are the low-hanging apples that you can bring back. Given you haven't had very high completion rates in the state, you've got some real good fodder to work with there. As you look at it, though, there's some again, pretty good news in Idaho. If you take a look, what you'll see is that from 2003 to 2013, there's been a radical increase in the share of your students who are enrolled who come from that Hispanic population. That is the fastest growing population. You've moved from 3% of your population up to 8%. That's very good news, and that's very substantial. In a decade, that's a huge shift. Now, they still represent 12% of your high school graduates and only 8% of your enrollments, so there's still work to be done there, but there's some very good work that's occurring there. So that's the why and the who. Now, we're also changing the way in which we measure the efficacy of our efforts. How successful are we in this enterprise as we look forward? And the big change here, the big change in higher education, all of those of you who work in higher education will appreciate this, is the focus now on completions rather than access. In 2000, we talked about public policy's purpose was to get access to higher education for all Americans who could benefit from it. There's a lot of our language. Today it is access to success. It is to making sure that those students who need the education are able to complete their education. So there's a huge focus on the completion agenda. From President Obama to almost every organization that works in this area to virtually every state's policies now focused on the issues of completion. And there are a couple of ways of looking at completion. One is to look at the attainment of your population. This has nothing really to do today with your institutions of higher education. It just says what share of our population have a college degree, whether they got it from us or somebody else or through transcendental meditation, whatever. How many have college education? And when you take a look at that, Idaho doesn't look very good. Actually, the United States doesn't look all that good. You can see the United States here is 11th in the world in the share of its young adults with a college education. Idaho, down here, ranks in the lowest quintile of the states in terms of the share of its young adult population. This is 25 to 34-year-olds with a college degree. From my perspective, even more of more concern than this is the fact that your young adult population is less well educated than your older adult population. And you're only one of 12 states in which that's the case. Unfortunately, and probably attributed to my leadership at WICHE over the last 15 years, 10 of those are WICHE states. But in fact, that's not what we generally think of as the American model, the American idea. We like to think that our next generation is going to be better prepared, better educated than we are. That's not the case in Idaho. I think it's a challenge for you as you move forward. So, attainment is one of the things that you look at. The other is, and the one you can do something about, are completions. Where are you in terms of completions? And this is an interesting story for the state as well. If you look at the country, and this is really phenomenal news. Remember I told you about a 31% increase in enrollments, 31% for both the nation and WICHE? Nationally, 59% increase in graduates. In the West, 74%. That's a huge, marvelous, positive story about the productivity of our systems of higher education. My God, I mean, that's more than 30% difference between the increases in participation and the increases in completion. Nobody is talking about this kind of success. When I started putting this presentation together, I hadn't been talking about it. Now I'm preaching it off. What a wonderful thing this is. The story in Idaho is sort of a mixed bag. Idaho's 65% is great. That's better than the national average, and that's a huge increase. But you're the only state in the West with which I work where that percentage is lower than the percentage growth in enrollments. So you haven't really kept up with the growth in enrollments. That is not true for your public system of higher education. Your public system grew by 48% in enrollments, 69% in terms of graduations. So that is very good. It's actually in the private sector where the enrollment growth, or the graduation growth has not kept pace with the enrollment growth. But you have a good story with respect to your public system of higher education. So completions were the name of the game. And competency, which I talked about earlier, is really the coin of the realm. But now here I'm not talking about competency programs. I'm talking about competency as the demonstrated measure of student learning. And so there's just a huge amount going on in terms of measuring student learning and using demonstrated competency as that measure. And we're doing that really for two reasons. And one of the reasons is we're doing it for students so that they can get credit for what they deserve and so that they can have better success and quicker opportunities for transfer and articulation and so that they can get through their programs quicker. This is particularly true for adult students coming back. And this is where we use prior learning assessment and CLEP exams and other testing to basically allow students to demonstrate that they shouldn't have to take something they already know. The second reason we do it is to get better at what we're doing. And I think there's an awful lot going on in this area, and it's very important to the state. If you haven't heard a lot about predictive analytics or big data in higher education, you soon will be. People are using predictive analytics now to learn more about their students so that they can take those students who are most at risk and identify them early enough that they can get in and intervene with them and help them out. I heard some wonderful things that are going on in community colleges here this morning in the hearing, but this predictive analytics really gives us the capacity to ramp up the improvements in the completion and the success of our students. So we're doing it for ourselves to get better, and there are a variety of ways in which we're doing them. I'm going to skip this because that was just redundant with what I'd said before. There is, if those two are important, the third one is perhaps even more important and is related to the second one, and this is the assessment of student learning. And it finally is something that higher education is coming to deal with reasonably comfortably. Not entirely comfortably, but reasonably so. And there are three reasons for that. One is that the time has come for it. We've evolved to the point where I think most people believe, we used to believe you should just believe we're good because we're higher education. Now we sort of believe that, it's legitimate to ask whether we can prove that. The second is that evidence-based practice has become a significant part of public policy. State governments don't just take your word for it anymore. They require that you demonstrate your efficacy. They're requiring that of the transportation department. They're requiring it of virtually every other department, and they're requiring it now of higher education in many places. We have to prove our merit. The third is that we can do it. We now demonstrate we have the tool. There are sure a lot of folks in the academy that don't agree with this. But if we believe in research, which we tell other businesses to use, if we believe in research, the research is clear. We have ways of measuring student learning outcomes in virtually any way you would like to have it, that demonstrate whether the students have learned what they need to know and be able to do. And so those three things are really driving a lot of effort for measuring student learning outcomes. But know that there is tremendous angst about this within the higher education community. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's un-American. We have in the United States a way we believe we have demonstrated our efficacy over time. It was a professor would make a determination of whether the students had learned what they needed to know and to what extent. And they assessed that student. And then the accumulation of that professor and 39 others, totaling to 120 hours, was evidence that the student had learned what they were supposed to know. That's the way we judge the efficacy of the enterprise. It was the academy that did that. And they're very uncomfortable with the idea of external validation, of somebody else coming in and saying what it is. Some of their concerns are just because we don't do it that way. Some of them are very legitimate concerns about what that external validation will focus on. Will it be only their workforce development, or will it include those other reasons we educate people? So there's a lot of discussion around that. Plus, we're still sorting out whose responsibility it is when we come up with this. What is the professor's role in this? What is the institution's role and the leadership of the institution? What is the governing board's responsibility, and what is the state's responsibility? And the real fear is that the state will start to do this, when in fact they may not be the best to get into that role, the state government. So how do you measure up on the issues around the quality of the enterprise you're giving? Well, one of the measures of quality or productivity, is really looking at productivity. That is, what does it cost per unit of outcome in your enterprise? So what are you getting for your investment? This is what the economists would say is the ultimate measure of quality. Are we getting what we pay for? And if you look at it, Idaho is doing quite well on the productivity issues. Overall, the system is not the most highly productive in the country, but it is relatively good in productivity. The cost per degree in Idaho is less than the cost per degree in most other states, about 15% less. If you look at your research universities, they're highly productive compared to other states. Again, much lower cost, about 15% lower than the cost per degree in other states on average. And your master's and baccalaureate fit into the same category, quite productive. Your community colleges are about average, nothing to be ashamed of there, but they aren't as dramatically better than other states. Overall, a quite highly productive enterprise. Now this is, the next slide is not so positive. What this really suggests to you is you're getting a lot for what you're paying for. I'll come back to that statement in a bit. Your completion rates are not particularly attractive. It's the reason you'll get a lower grade later on. Your public universities are well behind the public universities in the rest of the country. These are not IPEDS data. These are the data from the National Student Clearinghouse. They follow students, not just at your institutions. They follow whether your students who started at one of your institutions ever graduate from any institution. That's a much better measure than whether they graduate, whether your first-time full-time students graduate from your institution, which is the federal measure. This is the one that looks at the ultimate success of those students. In over 6 years, your public institutions are not competing favorably with the rest rest of the country. The community colleges are average, but the overall rate for community colleges is nonetheless troubling. So how do you compare on those things? That's sort of the assessment. Now let's look at the finances, because that's the final area. And this has been the most challenging period of time in my career for the last 15 years. 2 recessions, one the greatest recession since the Great Depression, huge changes, and they came at the end of what was the most inflationary period of prices and costs in higher education in the history of man. And this is what I'll show. These are the national figures. I'll show you 4 things on this. One is look at, you've all heard the mantra in higher education, the states don't love us anymore. They're reducing their support. And there's some support here for that. Here was the high point in state support. Here's what happened with the 2 recessions. There's been slight growth in the last couple of years, but by and large, that was a pretty precipitous drop in funding per student adjusted for inflation during that period of time. 3 things I'll mention from that. Nationwide, higher education can complain all they want about the reduction in funding, but they didn't have a reduction in funding. When you put tuition revenues in, they're right here at the highest level. This, incidentally, was the highest level of funding for higher education in history of man. Now, as the economist side of me says, that means we were less productive than we'd ever been before at that very time. When your cost per unit of activity is higher than it ever was, unless your quality is improving, you've just lost productivity. Our argument in higher education is this is where we should be. That's when we were really valued and when we were doing the best work. I don't know, but that's sort of the differences in opinion. But higher education nationwide did not suffer financially over time because they made up the entire difference with increases in tuition revenue. That's the set of lines. And so you wonder why people are concerned about affordability? Well, over the last 15 years, they've been really hammered. What is also interesting about this, though, and it's very important to look at, is look at the slope of that line that's there. And then look at the slope of the reduction in state support. You'll notice that the upward slope is almost identical to the downward slope. It wasn't that the states reduced their support for higher education on average. It was that the huge increase in the demand for higher education, that 31% increase in enrollments, essentially wasn't paid for by the states. The states invested as much as they had before. In fact, if you look at the aggregates, they're almost exactly the same. Is that they could not, the states simply in that period of time could not put more money in to support these students. So the funding per student went down. If you look at Idaho, it's a little bit different story. Idaho did real well and followed the national trends almost identically up to 2001. The difference was you were actually funded pretty well as a public system up until 2001 because you had relatively low tuitions compared to the rest of the country. And you looked pretty good up to that period of time. So you were, as a state, were doing fine. But since that period of time, the state has just, particularly with the second recession, really took huge chunks of change out of funding. It was both a function of the increase in enrollment, huge increase in enrollment, and actual dollar reductions. The state of Idaho was hit very hard by the recession, and it's reflected in these numbers. What is hugely different from the country is that you did not, to your credit, you did not essentially increase your tuitions to make up the entire loss. That's what the country did, but you didn't. But the net result is that, in fact, your funding today is at the lowest level it's been, well, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it was at the lowest level. It still is well below the historical averages. So the result of that is really sort of a mixed bag for you. If you look at state funding and where you are in terms of state funding per student, well, overall, the 64-34 is really right near the national average. It's not. Yeah, it's 2% below the national average. That's not a huge difference. But you do have, and that's sort of what you would predict on some others. Your state tax effort is close to the national average. You're a little low. but you're not really, you're right in the realm of the other states with a 7.2% effective tax rate compared to 7.6%. What is different is that your state tax effort for higher education is actually substantially higher than most states. 7.8% of your money goes to higher education compared to 5.8% in the country. In fact, you're the fourth highest in the WICHE states with which I work in that regard. So your legislature has been, compared to what they got with resources and effort, they've been reasonably generous with higher education. Doesn't feel that way to the presidents, I can tell you that for sure. But that's sort of where you are. Now, what does that mean overall when you put it all together? Well, your overall funding for higher education today, because of those reductions, is now 18% below the national average. 16% below the national average. You're funded at 84% of the national average. There are lots of states that are below you on that, and they make it up in tuition revenue. Not you. Your tuitions have traditionally been low, and they remain low. Your community colleges are pretty close to the national averages now. In fact, they're a little bit above the national averages. They were talking today at the meeting about how they're lower than Washington and Oregon, which is true. But Washington and Oregon are pretty high community college averages. Your four-year tuitions are actually substantially below the national averages for four-year institutions. 13% below the WICHE average, 28% below the national average. So when your funding is low and your tuition revenue, your state funding is low and your tuition revenue is low, the net effect is your funding is low. Your financial aid has been very modest in your state, particularly for need-based students. These numbers are the ones from 2 years ago. I'm not going to dwell on them because you've had some improvements since then, and the governor has proposed substantial improvements for this year. But the net effect of all of this is that your families in Idaho today have to pay a lot more of their income toward higher education than they did in 2000 at the beginning of this century. For community colleges, that has gone up from 2.7% to 6.5%. And for the four-year institutions, it's gone from 6.9% to 12% of average family income is required now to pay tuition, just tuition, at your colleges. And that's why you're feeling why a lot of you, a lot of your colleagues, a lot of your friends are concerned about higher education costs. Actually, still is a hell of a deal in Idaho, but it doesn't feel like the deal was 15 years ago or whenever. As a result, there's a huge change in the way in which we finance higher education in the United States. Lots of folks are referring to it as the new normal of finance for higher education. Now, why is there this thing? Well, the primary reason is that the model that we had was a hyperinflationary model that was simply unsustainable. I showed you how nationally it had gone up in the 90s, both in terms of the share coming from the states and the share that had come from students. It was going up to reach that high level in 2001 that was really a very high level of support for students. And that was not a model that could be sustained any more than our increases in healthcare can be sustained for the future. It wasn't the model we could live with and that public policy could live with. So what does the new normal look like? Well, in most states, it is performance funding of some fashion, outcomes-based funding. Most of the states now, I think about 36% of the states have gone to some, or say they've gone to some form of outcomes-based funding. That hasn't been where you've been in the past, could be in the future, but it's not been where Idaho went, in part because you were hanging on for the last few years for all practical purposes. But performance-based or outcomes-based funding is not the only game in town. There's also, and particularly over the last 2 years, a huge focus on affordability and how can we contain costs. And you've seen some what I think are fairly silly approaches to this around the country at both the state and the federal level for each college. Look, we don't have enough money right now in your system to do what we should be doing with what we've got. We don't want to take away one of the revenue sources from that. And you can bet your dollars that it's not going to be made up in corporations because there ain't no appropriations to be making it up. So I think that's a silly idea. What most states are doing in this is pretty reasonable public policy. They're trying to find a balance between tuition and financial aid policy to make it possible to tuition is not a punishment. It's a revenue source to make it possible for the institutions to provide quality education. And it's one of the two major revenue sources. So they're trying to find a way in which tuition revenue can be sustained to provide a quality education, use financial aid as a handle to make it more affordable, and find a reasonable way in which people can live with that. And so that's what most of the states are trying to do at the present time. At WICHE, we'd actually prefer that they looked at all three. Not just at those two finance policies, but that they also look at the appropriations to institutions. And that they really try to come up with a system that really blends all three of those financing streams together to provide quality, affordability, access, and success as they move along. That's what we're trying to work with states to get. I think, to his credit, I've looked at Governor Otter's request, and I think it's one of the best balance I've seen from a governor since I've been at WICHE. He's tried to find some ways in which he can help the institutions achieve some of that complete college Idaho stuff that you guys are talking about. And he's tried to constrain tuitions. And he's trying to provide more financial aid to both traditional and non-traditional students who need that. It's, from my perspective, a really pretty nifty package that he has put before you folks. All of which leads me to my sort of summing up comments, which are sort of what I started, which the times are changing an awful lot. They're changing a lot of the way in which we do this. They're changing who we do this for. They're changing the way in which we assess this. And they're changing the way in which we finance the enterprise. It's really a very exciting and potentially dangerous time for us, I suppose. What has this wrought for Idaho? I tried to figure out what I think these people would give you as grades today. Compared to what they had before. But it probably reflects more what they would give you today than what they would give you. In terms of preparation, I'd improve your grade from a B plus to a C. I actually think that there are a lot of things that you're doing, particularly the dual and concurrent enrollment and the activities and those that are really great and that they really improve. But the overall impact, you still have far too many students who don't graduate from high school. You have far too many who graduate from high school and don't go on to college. But equally important, you still have far too many who graduate from high school, go on to college, but aren't ready to do college work. So there's still a lot of work to be done on the preparation side. On the participation side, I moved you up from a D to a C minus for traditional students. Still need to do a much better job of getting those students into college. And I give you a really high grade on the older adults. I give you a B. I give you an A, except for you only came up to the national average. It's true, you doubled your share of participation. But to get the A, you'd have to move ahead a little bit further. But I think you are doing some good work in this area. And I really credit the state. I think it was really wise for the state to establish a college in the major metropolitan area focused on the students who aren't served as well in a research university. On affordability, I'd ask you to give you a lower grade. They gave you a B minus. I can't figure out why. I would move you to a C. Low tuition is nice, but it's not the access to affordability. You have to have a blend between reasonable tuition and strong financial aid, and you don't have a strong financial aid system. Now that's my grade. That's not what they would do. That's Dave Longanecker speaking. On completion, I'd move you from a C to a D. I think that completion rate overall is low. I do think it's important to realize in part why you have that. I mentioned it. You get a lot for what you pay for. Said slightly differently, you get what you pay for. And you're not getting as much as you could, in part because you're not investing as much as you might in this enterprise. In terms of quality and learning, I move you from an incomplete to a B on productivity. Those productivity numbers look pretty strong. And put an incomplete on student learning outcomes because as an industry, higher education still isn't quite there. So where does this take you in Idaho? Well, if you're comfortable with being a C state, you feel just fine. I mean, you know, average isn't always bad. And you can stay the course, and you've got a wonderful place to live, and life will be good. Now, if you want something more, then you're going to need a change agenda. And there is a lot of change going on, but you'll need more than what you've got. You're all probably familiar with Einstein's definition of insanity, which is basically insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting something different. I would recommend to you that you avoid insanity.
David, thank you very much for your thoughts. My question really is about, what's to say about the future of the academy and the administrators? How do we train them and prepare them for these changes that are certainly occurring all around us and in the future are going to be even more pressing?
I think it's going to be a very uncomfortable decade ahead, particularly for faculty, because faculty who believe this passion for shared governance really perceive that shared governance to be beyond what governance really means today. I mean, I think the faculty need to be actively engaged in the work around the curriculum. But the fact is, almost all of the programs, incidentally, this is much less true in the community colleges than it is in the four-year institutions. But if you take an institution like the University of Idaho or Idaho State or Boise State, the faculty there, most of the programs that exist were dreamed up by the faculty. And in the world in which we're existing today, most of the new programs are going to have to come from business, industry, the community, and others. And that's a fundamental change. So we've got programs, and we've got courses, and we've got minors and other things that are really built primarily for faculty. And that's going to be real hard to afford. That's what drove to that hyperinflationary model. Is that we really accommodated that very wonderful environment for faculty, but it was an expensive model of higher education, and we can't afford that model. And so there's going to have to be fundamental changes in the way in faculty. I mean, look at the faculty workload. Berkeley, I'll use another place. Berkeley in 1964, at the time it was ranked as probably one of the top 2 or 3 institutions in the world, not in the United States, in the world. Faculty taught on average 4 courses per term. Courses today, faculty teach 1.5 to 3 per year. That's because they're working on their scholarship, and we came to really value that and put a lot of, but that costs us an awful lot of money. Now, California afforded that for many years, but that's not going to be affordable in the future. So I think that's one of the huge things. I do think, though, that there's a tremendous sort of change occurring and a willingness to have discussions. At Arizona State University now, many of the faculty that are being hired into tenure-track positions are teaching faculty. And they are not expected to come in and have a research portfolio. They are expected to keep their scholarship up. But their primary responsibility is to teach 3 to 4 courses per term.
As you put up the diversity numbers, one of the things that I kind of reflected on as I looked around the room, predominantly white, and so you didn't include necessarily information about faculty and administrators and staff and folks at the different colleges, but do you have any suggestions on how we might change that aspect? Because until students see a diverse group of folks on campus, people who look like they do, it's going to be a challenge to get those folks comfortable.
Two things I say, Alan. One is you have to start. You're not going to solve that overnight because you have to. There's a lot of education that comes with getting to the faculty ranks, and so we have to find a way in which we can attract and retain people of color in graduate professional programs. And that's particularly difficult because if you get people in a faculty track, people of color, they're often really attractive to other industries as well. And so it's really tough to then keep them in academia, where we've got some really wonderful elements of our culture and community, but we don't pay as well as industry does, and so that's a real dilemma. We have to work on that. In the shorter term, it's going to be mostly annual faculty that are teaching those students of color. And that means we have to make sure that annual faculty have a better sense of what the cultural impediments are to success. success of students of color and what things are. And we've done a lot of work at WICHE with an organization out of the University of Southern California called the Center for Urban Education, run by a woman named Estelle Ben-Salon. And she does a wonderful job of working with faculty to help you folks see where your impediments to the progress of students of color are. And basically, she uses the faculty to develop the framework for looking at the efficacy of our efforts. And when they see their own data, show them that they're the problem, it's not their next door neighbor. It really does help in that regard. But both, you're going to have to work on both. But you have to recognize that tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, it's going to be your current faculty who make or break the futures of these students of color and these students who are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. And finding a way in which they better understand the environment that these students are coming from. And also understand that their job is to succeed with these students, not protect the institution from them. There still is, amongst many faculty, the idea that their job is to weed out the chaff. And we need to find a way in which faculty see that their primary responsibility is for students. You don't find that problem in private higher education institutions. Faculty understand it as though students don't stay. There's no tuition revenue to pay their salaries.
So when you look at performance-based budgeting and you're changing that model, so can you tell me what the metrics are used to do performance-based budgeting?
The best metrics in performance-based funding are metrics that measure what you want to achieve in performance. Now, the real concern many faculty and others have is that the metrics will essentially make it harder to serve the disadvantaged students. Graduations are one of the major measures, graduates. That's a very legitimate, if completion is what we're interested in, logically you want something there. But if it's completion rates, why the easiest way for an institution to get higher completion rates is to eliminate the denominator, that is to reduce the denominator rather than increase the numerator. Get rid of those students who aren't going to succeed. Then we'll get more money. So what you have to do is you have to be smart enough to understand that's not what you're interested in. What you want is more completions. So if you pay for more completions, not higher completion rates, and if you provide a premium for those students who are most at risk, you provide the capacity. In England, they provide 33 1/3% more funding for a student who comes from what we would call a zip code that reflects a lower income neighborhood. And they end up getting much higher completion rates from students from those neighborhoods than they used to, because the institutions are getting paid. So there are ways, it really depends. You have to tell me what your goals are first. If your goal is to look best on the national ratings, they're based on rates, then get rid of all of the students of color in your system because they're less likely to succeed. If your goal is to increase the equitable outcomes, then provide incentives in the completion for those students as well as for others.
I'm interested in particular two things. One is, how do we partner with secondary schools or change our partnership attitude? How do we partner with businesses? And how can we embed the educational process into secondary schools and within the business environment, and not necessarily have them come to the university or college for educational training?
I'll try and remember those if I don't. I'm getting old and whatever. So the first one is, how do you embed this with the school districts and partnership? One is to share information back and forth. And high schools need to know whether it's their students that are succeeding and failing or not. Yeah, they need to know that, and if the word isn't getting down to the people lots of times, you probably have feedback loop, Matt, I don't know. My bet is that few of the teachers know whether their students were the ones that were succeeding or not. And you have to be able to tell them whether they're succeeding. The others to work more closely, and I think dual and concurrent enrollment, start to provide real nice relationships, because that's what ultimately comes down to is human relationships that help establish what works and what doesn't. So I think part of this is getting good information I believe data is very key to management decisions and to educational decisions. So information is key in that. With businesses, there's a lot of work that's going on today with leadership and business engagement, and I think all of that's good. What we don't do in America that they do better in a number of other countries, much better in Canada than we do, is not just working with business, not just getting counsel from business, not just this and that. It's actually developing educational programs with business, doing co-op work study. Now, we think that that's the purview of community colleges, and God knows it is important in apprenticeship programs and all of those kinds of things. There's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be doing more of that in our four-year institutions as well. I mean, you're building this computer science program in Boise State and one of the companies in town. Those ought to be, I hope there's some co-op work study programs that are part of that. Think about the best form of student financial aid that could be. The student working for a company, earning a wage, half-time work, half-time study, the work people, adjunct faculty at the institution, working with the faculty at the institution, providing a very rich liberal arts and professional experience for that student as they come out. You know, we kind of do this. We've been doing this forever in education. I'm not sure we do it particularly well with our practice teachers. We don't pay them. We should pay people. When people do work, they should get paid. But we should have a way in which we're really blending these two things together for a lot more students than we do today. And then we'll have the input from business that we need. It won't be just advice, counsel, and occasional meeting. It'll be the way we do business. So that's the second one. The third one is, I think there is a lot of recognition today that there are avenues other than just the four-year degree. There are legitimate ways to move to the workforce. I heard beautiful examples of that this morning in the testimony from the community colleges. What I would say, however, and I believe this strongly, there is still tremendous value to the baccalaureate degree for late adolescent young adults. It is one of the reasons we lead the world in many of our civic as well as our business activities. In many of the ways in which we work with other countries is because we're educated beyond high school. And I think there's real value to still be had for many people in that regard. Not everybody. People who want to go immediately into the trades or whatever should be able to do that. But if a student really wants to go to college, I say this in part because I was encouraged to be a carpenter. My dad was a carpenter, and that's really what the people in Chelan, Washington thought I should be. Because we were poor, and I mean, whatever. Fortunately, I was terrible with my hands. And I was also fortunate to have parents who really saw value beyond that. And my life has been hugely enriched because of what education provided for me at public institutions in Washington State, and then afterwards in graduate school. So I still think there's tremendous value to be had in that, and we shouldn't undervalue that. But that's not for everybody. And people who choose a different path should not be presumed to be on the wrong path. One of the beauties of my career, I spent a number of years in Minnesota. And in Minnesota, the trades were valued extremely high. There was this sort of Germanic attitude in Minnesota. And they had these vocational technical schools. And if your child went to TVI, well, that was just as good going to college, maybe better, because they'd actually get a job in a couple of years. And so there was real value to that. I think we have to find a way in which we value both of those. What we need to do, what you need to do in Idaho, is make people understand, though, that that's not going to come without some continued form of education beyond high school. In the complexity of the world we have today, the jobs you could get, carpenter job I conceivably could have gotten out of high school, is a much more complex job today because you've got to understand the physics, the geometry, the chemistry, actually, of building trades.
Politics for Lunch is presented by the Andrews Center for Public Policy, a nonprofit organization and a division of Boise State University's College of Social Sciences and Public Affairs, Our mission is to explore and promote public lands and the environment, education, and leadership. You can learn more at andrewscenter.boisestate.edu.